The promotion meeting was supposed to be the best moment of my career. For 3 years I had worked harder than anyone in my department. I stayed late when projects fell behind, helped coworkers solve problems, and took responsibility whenever something went wrong. I never complained about the extra work because I believed something simple: if you kept doing the right thing long enough, eventually someone would notice. So when everyone gathered in the conference room that morning, I felt nervous but hopeful. My supervisor, Mr. Caldwell, stood at the front with a folder in his hand. He smiled as if the decision had already been settled for a long time. "We've made our decision," he said. My hands tightened around my notebook as I waited. Then he announced that the promotion was going to his nephew, Brandon. For a moment the entire room went quiet. I thought maybe I had misunderstood what he said. I had led the department's biggest project that year and trained several new employees myself. Brandon had only joined the company a few months earlier. Mr. Caldwell looked straight at me and gave a small shrug. "Leadership just isn't for everyone, Amara," he said calmly. The meeting ended soon after that, and people began leaving the room in silence. I stayed in my chair for a second longer, trying to understand what had just happened. That was when I noticed something unusual. The CEO was still sitting at the far end of the table, quietly looking down at the promotion file in front of him. The next morning I came to work as if nothing had happened. A few coworkers looked at me with sympathy as I walked past their desks, but nobody said anything directly. In offices like ours, people usually avoid discussing decisions made by management. I sat down, turned on my computer, and focused on the work in front of me. Not long after that, one of the newer employees approached my desk looking confused. He explained that he was struggling to understand the client reporting system and didn't know how to finish his task. Technically, he should have gone to the new manager for help, but instead he came to me. I showed him the process step by step, explaining where the numbers came from and how the final report should look. By the time he left my desk, his shoulders had relaxed and he looked relieved. Before lunchtime I helped 2 other coworkers solve small issues with their projects. It felt like a normal workday again, and the department slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Later that afternoon, while I was getting coffee, one of the senior analysts leaned closer and spoke quietly. "You know something strange?" she said. I looked at her. "During the promotion interviews, you actually had the highest evaluation score." I stared at her, confused. If that was true, then the decision made at the meeting didn't make sense at all. As I walked back to my desk, I noticed something else. The CEO was walking down the hallway carrying the promotion hiring file. Brandon moved into the manager's office that same day. He walked through the department with loud confidence, greeting everyone as if he had been leading the team for years. Some people smiled politely, but the mood in the room felt different now. Within the first hour he stepped out of his office holding a stack of reports and called my name. "Amara, can you come here for a second?" I walked over, and he asked me to explain how the client tracking system worked. It was a system every department manager was expected to understand before taking the role, but I patiently showed him the process anyway. I pointed out how the reports were updated and where the key information appeared. He nodded quickly, as if pretending he already understood everything. Good, he said. "You'll probably need to help me with this kind of thing from time to time." I returned to my desk and continued working. Later that afternoon another problem appeared with an overdue shipment order. Brandon spent nearly 20 minutes trying to solve it before eventually walking over to my desk again and asking if I could take a look. I checked the system and fixed the issue in a few minutes. As he walked back to his office, I happened to glance toward the hallway. Standing near the corner was the CEO. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was simply watching the department quietly, as if he were paying attention to something most people hadn't noticed yet. A few days passed after the promotion meeting, and the department slowly settled into an uncomfortable routine. Brandon stayed inside the manager's office most of the time, but problems still found their way to my desk. I didn't complain about it. Helping the team had always been part of my job, title or not. One evening near closing time, a junior employee rushed to my desk looking pale and nervous. She explained that she had entered the wrong numbers in a client report, and the mistake could cause a serious issue with one of our biggest accounts. If the report went out like that, the company could lose a lot of money. She looked like she was about to cry. Instead of blaming her, I asked her to sit down and show me what happened. We went through the report together and found the error. Fixing it would take time, but it could be done before the report reached the client. I stayed late that night correcting the numbers and double-checking the entire file. By the time I finished, the office was quiet and almost empty. The next morning everything was running smoothly again, and the junior employee thanked me quietly before starting her work. I thought the situation had ended there. But later that afternoon, as I walked past the executive offices, I noticed the CEO standing by the window. And he gave me a small nod, as if he already knew what had happened. Later that week, I was sitting in the break area when one of my coworkers joined me with a tired expression. He had been with the company longer than most of us and had seen many management decisions come and go. "You know," he said after a moment, "you shouldn't expect fairness in a place like this." I looked at him curiously. He explained that promotions often depended on connections more than ability. In his opinion, Mr. Caldwell had simply chosen family over merit, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. "Hard work doesn't always matter," he said quietly. I thought about his words for a moment before answering. "Maybe not immediately," I said, "but I still believe honesty counts for something." He gave a small laugh, clearly unconvinced. We finished our coffee and returned to our desks. Work continued as usual, but something about the department felt tense. Small mistakes were appearing more often, and Brendan seemed unsure how to handle them. Later that afternoon, I passed the executive floor again and noticed something unusual. The CEO was speaking with someone from Human Resources. And in his hands was the same promotion hiring file I had seen earlier. Over the next few days, the department began showing small signs of trouble. Deadlines started slipping, and communication between teams became slower. Brendan tried to lead meetings, but he often struggled to answer simple questions about the projects already in progress. Most of the team quietly came to me when they needed help. I never tried to undermine him or make him look bad. I simply explained what needed to be done and helped the team move forward. My focus was always the same: keep the work running smoothly. One morning a client called about a delayed shipment order that had been approved incorrectly. Brendan spent almost half an hour trying to understand the problem before finally asking if I could review it. I checked the order details and quickly found the issue. A simple correction fixed the delay. The client was satisfied, and the team returned to work. Later that afternoon, I noticed several senior managers walking toward the executive offices. Something serious seemed to be happening upstairs. As I was leaving for the day, I passed the conference room and saw the CEO sitting alone inside. The hiring file was open on the table in front of him. And he was studying the documents very carefully. The following week started like any other, but the quiet tension in the department had not disappeared. People were still adjusting to the new management structure, although most of the team continued to rely on each other to keep things running smoothly. One afternoon, while reviewing some data reports, a coworker pulled a chair next to my desk. "You remember the promotion interviews last month?" he asked. I nodded. Each candidate had presented their ideas to a small panel of managers. It had taken weeks to prepare. "Well," he continued quietly, "I spoke with someone who sat on that panel." I looked up from my screen. "He said your presentation scored the highest out of everyone." For a moment I just stared at him. That didn't make sense. If the scores were truly that high, the decision announced in the conference room should have been different. "Are you sure?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "I wouldn't mention it if I wasn't." The thought stayed in my mind for the rest of the day. I tried to focus on my work, but something about the situation felt strange now. As I was leaving the building that evening, I happened to glance toward the executive floor. The CEO was walking into his office. And in his hand was the same hiring file he had been reviewing all week. That night I kept thinking about the conversation with my coworker. I had never worried too much about scores or rankings during the interview process. I simply focused on presenting my ideas clearly and honestly. Still, the comment stayed in my mind. The next morning, work continued as usual. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and the department settled into its daily rhythm. Brendan held a short team meeting, but most of the discussion ended with him asking the team for suggestions on how to handle certain tasks. By midday, several employees had come to my desk asking for advice on their projects. I helped where I could, making sure deadlines stayed on track. Later in the afternoon, I walked upstairs to deliver a completed report to accounting. As I passed the executive hallway, I noticed the CEO speaking quietly with someone from Human Resources. The hiring file was open on the table between them. They were looking closely at several pages, pointing at numbers and making notes. The moment I walked past, they stopped talking. I continued down the hallway, pretending not to notice. But something about the serious expressions on their faces told me one thing clearly. The CEO had found something in that file. And whatever it was, it had his full attention. 2 days later, the department held a meeting with several senior executives to review our latest project progress. Brendan was responsible for presenting the update. The team gathered in the large conference room while he prepared his slides on the screen. I sat near the back of the table, quietly reviewing some notes in case questions came up. When the presentation started, everything seemed normal at first. Brandon explained the project timeline and described the expected results. But after a few minutes, the questions began. One of the executives asked about a key section of the project strategy. Brandon hesitated before answering, clearly unsure about the details. Another executive asked how the department planned to handle the next phase of development. Brandon paused again. The room grew uncomfortable. Then the CEO, who had been listening silently, leaned forward slightly. Who originally led this project? He asked calmly. Several people in the room turned their heads in the same direction. Toward me. For a moment, nobody spoke. The CEO followed their gaze. Then he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect. After the meeting ended, people left the conference room slowly, whispering to each other. I stayed behind for a moment, collecting my notes and trying not to draw attention to myself. The CEO's question still echoed in my mind. Who originally led this project? Everyone in that room had known the answer. Later that afternoon, I returned to my desk and focused on finishing the remaining tasks for the day. Work had always been the easiest place to put my attention when things felt uncertain. Just before closing time, a message appeared in my inbox from the executive office. It wasn't addressed directly to me. It had been sent to the department managers. But the subject line caught my eye. Project ownership verification. I didn't think much about it until I noticed Brandon leaving his office a few minutes later. He walked down the hallway toward the executive floor carrying several folders under his arm. He looked tense. An hour later, as I was preparing to leave for the evening, I passed the executive offices again. Through the open door of a conference room, I saw the CEO sitting with two people from the technology department. On the large screen behind them was the company project database. And my name appeared at the top of the original project file. The next morning, the department felt unusually quiet. Normally people talked while preparing reports or answering early emails, but now the atmosphere felt more serious. Brandon arrived later than usual and went straight into his office without greeting anyone. Around mid-morning, he called me inside. I need to confirm something about the project system, he said, trying to sound casual. When the files are created, whose name appears as the project owner? I explained that the system automatically recorded the name of the person who started the project. He nodded slowly, as if thinking carefully about my answer. That can't be changed later, right? He asked. Not without leaving a record, I replied. He thanked me quickly and ended the conversation. As I walked back to my desk, I noticed two members of the IT department entering the executive conference room down the hall. Later that afternoon, I saw them again, speaking quietly with the CEO. They were holding printed pages from the database logs. Whatever the CEO was investigating, it was becoming very detailed. And judging from the serious looks on their faces, the answers they were finding were not simple ones. 2 days later, another meeting was scheduled with several executives and department leaders. This time Brandon looked even more nervous than before. When the meeting started, the CEO asked for a quick update on the project that had been discussed earlier in the week. Brandon gave a short explanation and tried to move through the presentation quickly. Then the CEO raised his hand. I'd like to review the project records, he said calmly. One of the IT specialists connected a laptop to the conference room screen. The company database appeared, showing a long list of project files and development notes. The CEO pointed to one particular file. Open this one. The screen changed, revealing the original project entry. The room went silent. At the top of the page, under the section labeled Project Owner, was a single name. Mine. The CEO studied the screen carefully before looking around the table. So this project, he said slowly, was created and developed by Amara? Several managers nodded. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For a moment, the CEO didn't say anything more. But the way he closed the laptop told me one thing clearly. This discovery was only the beginning. After the meeting about the project records, the department returned to work, but something had clearly changed. People spoke more quietly, and there was a feeling that something serious was happening behind the scenes. That afternoon, I noticed Brandon leaving the executive offices again. His face looked tense, and he walked past the department without saying anything. Later, while delivering some documents to accounting, I passed the conference room near the executive floor. The door was slightly open. Inside, the CEO was sitting with two members of Human Resources. The hiring file was spread across the table, and several printed pages were placed beside it. They were comparing numbers carefully. One of the HR officers pointed to a page and said something quietly. The CEO leaned forward and looked at the document again. Even from the doorway, I could see rows of evaluation scores written in neat columns. Then the CEO picked up another sheet and placed it next to the first one. The 2 pages did not match. He frowned slightly and began writing notes on a small pad. I moved on quickly so they wouldn't notice me standing there. But one thought stayed in my mind the entire walk back to my desk. The CEO had just discovered something in the hiring file. And it looked like the numbers didn't add up. The following morning, I arrived at work earlier than usual. The office was still quiet, with only a few employees preparing for the day. As I organized my tasks, I noticed Brandon walking through the department with a worried expression. He barely spoke to anyone before disappearing into his office. A short time later, I saw him leaving the office again and heading upstairs toward the executive floor. About an hour passed before he returned. He looked even more tense than before. Later that afternoon, the senior analyst who had mentioned the interview scores earlier stopped by my desk again. "I heard something interesting," she said quietly. I looked up from my computer. The CEO asked HR to bring the original evaluation forms from the promotion interviews. I felt a small wave of confusion. "The originals?" I asked. She nodded. Apparently the summary sheet in the hiring file doesn't match the interview records. For a moment neither of us spoke. If the summary sheet had been changed, it meant someone had altered the final scores after the interviews were completed. That was not a small mistake. As she walked away, I glanced down the hallway toward the executive offices. And I wondered who would have had access to those documents. Later that week the CEO called my supervisor, Mr. Caldwell, into his office. Most of the department noticed when it happened. Mr. Caldwell usually walked through the office confidently, greeting people with a relaxed smile. This time he moved quickly and quietly toward the executive floor. The door to the CEO's office closed behind him. For almost an hour no one saw him come out. Work continued across the department, but everyone seemed distracted. When Mr. Caldwell finally returned, he looked different. His usual calm confidence was gone. He walked straight to his office and closed the door without speaking to anyone. Not long after that, I saw the CEO step out of his office and walk toward the conference room again. The hiring file was still in his hands. He sat down alone at the table and began reading through the documents once more, page by page. From my desk across the hallway, I could see him stop at a particular sheet and study it carefully. He leaned back in his chair and looked thoughtful for several seconds. Then he turned the page. Whatever he had just found in that file, it clearly wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it looked like the investigation was only getting deeper. Over the next few days, the department tried to continue working as if nothing unusual was happening. Deadlines still needed to be met, clients still needed answers, and reports still needed to be completed. But beneath the normal routine, everyone could sense that something important was unfolding. Brandon seemed quieter than before. He spent more time inside his office and rarely walked around the department the way he had during his first week as manager. Meanwhile, I focused on helping the team stay organized. Several coworkers came to me with questions about their projects, and I guided them through the steps needed to keep everything on track. It was the same role I had played for years, even without the title. One afternoon, while discussing a client issue with 2 analysts, I noticed the CEO standing near the hallway entrance again. He wasn't interrupting or giving instructions. He was simply observing. For several minutes he watched how the team worked together and how problems were solved. Eventually his eyes rested on me as I explained a solution to one of the analysts. He didn't say anything. But the thoughtful expression on his face made me realize something. He wasn't just reviewing documents anymore. He was studying how the department truly functioned. Later that week, an unusual request came from the executive office. Human Resources asked several employees, including me, to confirm details about the promotion interview process. They wanted to know who had participated in the panel, how the scores were recorded, and how the final results had been delivered to management. The question seemed simple, but the timing felt important. I explained that after the interviews, the panel members submitted their scores to Human Resources, and a summary sheet was prepared for the final decision. That was the standard procedure. Later that afternoon I saw 2 HR representatives entering Mr. Caldwell's office. The door remained closed for nearly half an hour. When they finally left, Mr. Caldwell looked visibly unsettled. He spent the rest of the day speaking on the phone behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the CEO continued his quiet routine of observation. Every now and then he would pass through the department hallway, watching how the team worked and how tasks were handled. By the end of the day, one thing was becoming clear. The investigation was no longer just about the hiring file. It was about understanding how the entire decision had been made. A few days later, I was finishing a report when an email appeared from the executive office announcing a leadership meeting scheduled for the following morning. Several senior managers, HR representatives, and department heads were asked to attend. Brandon received the message as well. When he read it, his expression changed immediately. The next morning, everyone gathered in the large executive conference room. The atmosphere felt serious, and conversations were quieter than usual. The CEO entered the room carrying the hiring file that had been under review for days. He placed it carefully on the center of the conference table. No one spoke. For a moment he simply looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. Then he opened the file and slowly turned to one of the pages inside. "Before we continue," he said calmly, "I would like to review the promotion process that took place last month." Several people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The CEO lifted a sheet of paper from the file and placed it on the table where everyone could see it. "These," he continued, "are the original evaluation scores submitted by the interview panel." The room became completely silent. And for the first time, it felt like the truth was finally about to come out. The executive conference room felt unusually tense that morning. Everyone who had been asked to attend sat quietly around the long table, waiting for the meeting to begin. Brandon sat beside my supervisor, Mr. Caldwell, while several members of human resources and senior management took their seats across from them. The CEO remained standing for a moment before opening the hiring file in front of him. "As most of you know," he began calmly, "this meeting concerns the promotion decision that was made last month." He lifted a sheet of paper and placed it in the center of the table so everyone could see it. "These are the original evaluation forms submitted by the interview panel." The pages showed several columns of numbers and signatures from the managers who had participated in the interviews. I recognized the format immediately. The CEO then placed another sheet beside it. "This," he continued, "is the summary page that was included in the final hiring file." Several people leaned forward to compare the two documents. Within seconds, the difference became clear. The numbers on the summary sheet did not match the scores recorded on the original evaluations. A quiet murmur spread across the room. The CEO allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "It appears," he said slowly, "that these scores were altered after the interview process was completed." The room remained silent as the CEO continued turning the pages in the hiring file. No one seemed eager to speak first. Finally, one of the HR managers cleared her throat. "The original evaluation scores are submitted directly to Human Resources," she explained. "After that, a summary sheet is created for management review." The CEO nodded. "And who has access to edit that summary sheet?" he asked. The HR manager hesitated for a moment before answering. "Only the department supervisor responsible for the position." Everyone in the room understood what that meant. The CEO turned to another document and slid it across the table. "This is the document history for the evaluation summary," he said. The page showed a list of edits, along with the usernames of the employees who had accessed the file. The last recorded edit had been made 2 days before the promotion meeting. The name beside the entry belonged to Mr. Caldwell. My supervisor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation," he said quickly. But the CEO did not respond right away. Instead, he calmly turned to the next section of the file. "And that," he said, "is only part of the issue." The CEO placed another set of documents on the table. "These are the project records connected to the promotion review," he said. Several people in the room recognized the project immediately. It had been the largest and most successful project completed by our department that year. According to the summary in the hiring file, the project had been listed as Brandon's primary achievement. The CEO looked toward the IT specialist sitting near the end of the table. "Please open the original project database," he said. The specialist connected a laptop to the conference room screen. Within seconds, the company database appeared on the display. "Search the project name," the CEO instructed. The file opened. At the top of the page, under the section labeled Project Owner, a single name appeared. "Mine." The room became very quiet. The CEO folded his hands on the table and looked around slowly. "So this project," he said, "was created and led by Amara." Several managers nodded in agreement. Across the table, Brandon looked stunned. Mr. Caldwell's expression had turned pale. For a moment no one spoke. Then the CEO closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "Now," he said calmly, "we can finally discuss how this promotion decision was really made." The room remained completely silent after the CEO spoke. No one rushed to defend the decision anymore. The documents on the table had already told most of the story. The CEO closed the hiring file slowly and rested his hands on the table. Let's review what we know, he said calmly. He pointed first to the evaluation sheets. The original interview scores show that Amara received the highest rating from the panel. Then he moved his hand to the summary page. But the numbers were changed on this document before the final decision was announced. Next he nodded toward the screen where the project database had appeared earlier. And the largest project listed as Brandon's achievement was actually created and led by Amara. The CEO looked directly at Mr. Caldwell. Those are two serious discrepancies. Mr. Caldwell tried to clear his throat. I may have adjusted the scores slightly, he admitted. But Brandon deserved the opportunity. The CEO's expression remained calm. Changing official evaluation records is not a small adjustment, he replied. Then he leaned back in his chair. And placing a relative into a position based on altered records violates company policy. No one spoke. The entire room seemed to be waiting for what would happen next. For a moment the CEO simply looked around the room, making sure everyone understood the situation clearly. Then he spoke again. Effective immediately, he said, Mr. Caldwell is removed from his supervisory role while this matter is formally reviewed. The words landed heavily in the quiet room. Mr. Caldwell looked stunned. Brandon stared at the table in front of him, saying nothing. Two members of Human Resources quietly stood and asked Mr. Caldwell to step outside with them. After a few seconds of hesitation, he slowly pushed back his chair and walked toward the door. Brandon followed shortly after, still looking shocked by everything that had just happened. When the door closed behind them, the tension in the room seemed to ease slightly. The CEO looked down at the hiring file one last time before shutting it completely. Fairness is not optional in this company, he said to the remaining managers. Our decisions must reflect the work people actually do. Several heads nodded around the table. Then the CEO turned his attention toward me. His expression had softened slightly, but the seriousness in his voice remained. Amara, he said, please stay for a moment after the meeting. The meeting ended shortly afterward, and most of the managers quietly left the room. I remained seated as the CEO organized the documents in the hiring file. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he looked up at me. I've been watching how your department operates over the past few weeks, he said. Even without the title, your coworkers naturally come to you for guidance. I didn't know what to say, so I simply listened. You solve problems calmly, he continued. You help your team succeed, and you take responsibility when things go wrong. He paused for a moment before closing the file. That is what real leadership looks like. The words felt surprising to hear out loud. The CEO stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city before turning back to face me again. The promotion process will be corrected, he said. Then he gave a small, confident nod. And I believe the right person for that position has been clear all along. For the first time since the promotion meeting weeks earlier, I felt something shift inside me. The story that had started with disappointment was finally moving toward its real conclusion. That afternoon, the whole department was called back into the conference room. Word had already spread that something serious had happened upstairs, and people entered quietly, looking from one face to another. I took my seat near the middle of the table, trying to stay calm, but my heart was beating hard again, just like it had on the day of the first announcement. A few moments later, the CEO walked in. He stood at the front of the room and looked around before speaking. After reviewing the promotion process, he said, it is clear that the wrong decision was made. The room went still. He explained that the interview scores had been altered and that project credit had been placed under the wrong name. Then he said the words I had almost stopped hoping to hear. The department manager position should have gone to Amara. For 1 second, I could barely move. Then the room filled with applause. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind that comes when people have been waiting for the truth and finally hear it out loud. I stood slowly, still trying to take it in. The CEO gave me a small nod, and in that moment I understood something I would never forget. Titles can be delayed. Recognition can be stolen for a while. But real work leaves a trail, and truth has a way of catching up. That evening, when the office had finally gone quiet, I stood inside the manager's office and looked out at the department I had helped carry for so long. I did not feel proud because someone else had fallen. I felt grateful because fairness had found its way back. And I made myself one promise. I would lead this team the same way I had worked all those years, with patience, honesty, and respect. Because real leadership is not about who is favored in a room. It is about who people trust when everything starts to fall apart.